Okay, go ahead and get started here. Welcome everybody to this session, Forest in the Trees and Grass, Procuring Climate Smart Forest Products and Bamboo. While not necessarily a new material, mass timber is growing in popularity as a lower carbon alternative to concrete and steel. The session will dive into what designers need to know in order to get mass timber and forest products right, and what innovations are occurring that we can likely expect to see in the future marketplace. For those of you looking to get AIA continuing education credit, the learning objectives are shown here, and we'll follow up with a survey on survey with more information on how to receive credit. We'll also collect all the questions submitted through the Q&A box, and if the speakers aren't able to get to that in today's presentation, we'll have them answer it later, and we'll post that to the CarbonPositive website. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the session, Jan-Peter Koppitz. Jan-Peter, or JP, is an associate at Arup, where he has worked since 2000 in their London, Madrid, and San Francisco offices, and he's now currently in their Berlin office. A structural engineer, JP has been actively challenging clients, collaborators, and contractors to find and implement solutions in timber. With that, I'll hand it over to you, JP.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session, Forest and the Trees. I will now switch over to my screen. As Lindsay mentioned, forest and the trees, forest and the grass. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm a structural engineer, so I'm a designer. And as designers, especially as structural engineers, we always ask ourselves, how can we actually also help to build carbon neutral buildings? A lot of structural engineers find that, oh, building materials, they're a small part. But I think, but building materials actually play a large role. This is the ice cream cone of sustainable design, I call it, and the building use and operation and all the MAP systems, and are equally important as the structural materials. They're the two ice cream balls that go into the cone. And so if we want to be lean and be clean and be green, specifying materials and thinking about the actual structural side of things is equally important. But we as designers, we're involved at the beginning of a project, right? That's when we have the most say and can actually influence the sustainability equation. So one thing we like to do is right at the beginning is identify material strategies, right? Because as the project goes along, our involvement decreases. And so at the beginning, we want to make sure we get it right. That's where we have our say in specifying timber, in specifying different materials like bamboo. But we need a good system. We need to be able to rely on frameworks so that the timber, the wood, and the bamboo that we specify is a sustainable material. So in today's session, we have with us Radha and Troy, and they're going to help us answer these questions that we as designers often have. How can I actually, if I source wood, how do I know it'll be from sustainable sources, right? And also, if I don't want to use wood, if I want to use other products, bamboo, for example, how can I actually find them? And equally, how can I specify them correctly? And so Radha Kuppalli, she's from New Forest. She's focused on driving capital markets towards investing in sustainable development, ensuring that sustainable wood sources are available in the built environment. And Troy Carter will help us answer the questions on bamboo. He's intent on making bamboo a primary global construction material, and he will tell us all about bamboo today. And with that, I will hand it over to Radha.
Hi, everyone. Let me get my presentation up. Oops, I'm on the wrong slide here. Well, thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak to you all today. So I want to talk a bit about sustainable forestry and its role in our net zero transition. So a little bit about New Forests. We were founded 15 years ago, and we're a forestry investment management company for institutional investors, so pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. The vision of our company is to see forestry as a key sector helping to lead the transition to a sustainable future. So the way that we approach that is to create productive and sustainable landscapes where we're not only generating excellent returns for our clients, but also creating benefits for the communities where we operate. So we have about $4 billion in assets under management, which consists of about 1 million hectares of forest plantations, conservation areas, rural land, carbon projects, and other kinds of conservation investments across Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and the US. So sustainable forestry is a critical climate solution. And in fact, the sustainable land use transition is as important as the clean energy transition when we think about transitioning to a net zero economy. And it's widely recognized that about 25% of the solution to climate change will actually need to come from the sustainable land or from sustainable land management, which is about 10 billion tons of CO2 emission reductions per year. And the actions that need to be taken include protecting the forests that we already have, managing working forests and agricultural lands better, and restoring native ecosystems to the tune of millions of hectares around the world. And these are all, critical natural climate solutions to help us meet our critical climate targets. And so these are some of the things that we're thinking about as a business as we're managing landscapes. So the carbon cycle and, the sort of right side of this diagram is a lot of what we're thinking about as a forest manager when we're managing our forests. So everything from ensuring that we're managing the land in a sustainable manner, having sustainable harvesting, making sure plant areas are replanted. But the thing that's also very important is that the emergence of a circular bioeconomy is equally critical here, which could alleviate resource supply constraints, minimize waste, substitute sustainable wood fiber for fossil fuel-based materials, and relieve the pressures on land. So certainly the built environment requires sustainable forest products, such as sustainable engineered wood products for a low carbon and sustainable economy. So to get to Jan's question, how do we actually start to think about that, and how can we actually start to ensure that we have this in our supply chain? This is actually quite a complicated question. What is sustainable forestry? From a New Forest perspective, we think about sustainable landscape investment, and this is actually kind of a proprietary approach of how we as an investment manager think about this. And so for us, there are probably 6 core elements of sustainable land management, sustainable forestry management. So that includes things like productivity, so ensuring that we have good biological productivity in our investing in research and development, so we produce more per hectare of land that we're managing. That we have very rational land use, so that we're looking at the economic, social, environmental consequences of how we manage land and ensure that we conserve and restore areas as well as manage some areas productively. That we have good risk management and governance systems, that we're ensuring the safety of people that we're working with, that we're managing things like fire risk, that we have good systems and policies in our forest. Shared prosperity, so that the needs and benefits accrue to the communities where we operate, and that we're contributing to local employment and rural livelihoods. And finally, and most importantly as well, ecosystem services, so that we're managing biodiversity, carbon, climate, and water aspects sustainably on the land. And so from our view, it's this kind of holistic framework that enhances investment performance. And it's incumbent on us as an investment manager that we report to our clients and our stakeholders regularly around how we're doing across all of these areas of sustainable land management. So the question, I guess, for people who are on the on the webinar today is, how do you actually understand if these kinds of aspects are actually being considered in your forest management? How do you think about having this sort of certified or disclosed? One of the key tools that we have at our disposal, and some of you may be aware of this, is third-party forest certification. which applies to all the operational activities associated with managing a forest estate. And things like chain of custody certification means that, going from the forest to the mill to the end buyer, that you've got transparency in the supply chain. So Forest Stewardship Council is considered the gold standard for forest management globally. And on the left side, I've got a box there that tells you all of the things that FSC is looking out for, from legal compliance to workers' rights and indigenous rights, making sure that environmental and social values and there's good management planning. And this is a tool that we use across our estate globally. I guess the thing to point out here, though, is that FSC doesn't cover everything. There are also emerging tools around climate and climate reporting and carbon accounting, which are going to be increasingly embedded in forest management and into supply chains. There are concerns about things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think the whole area of, what is sustainable forestry, how do we measure, and how do we report on it is evolving. But certainly, third-party certification like FSC is a critical place to start. I thought I'd quickly provide just a couple of case studies of how we incorporate this into our assets. So for example, we have a sawmilling business here in Australia called Timberland, Australia, where we manage an FSC certified integrated supply chain where our forestry pine plantation assets in South Australia and Tasmania provide the bulk of the wood products for the Timberland sawmills. And so this is been a company that's been pretty much focused on the domestic housing market here in Australia, but is now seeing the opportunity to move into mass timber and is now in the process of building new CLT and GLT manufacturing facilities in South Australia, Victoria, over the next couple of years. Further to that, the business itself is also on its path to going carbon neutral and also has taken on significant emission reduction targets between now and 2030. In Laos, so we also operate in Southeast Asia. We're also looking at an integrated supply chain. We've achieved FSC certification and IFC performance standard certification on our mixed acacia eucalyptus plantation in Laos. We've also had key environmental and social achievements, including looking at community engagement, working with youth in the area to develop employment opportunities, developing the local contractor capacity. So some of that, again, is captured in the FSC. Some of it sits outside of it. But again, we'll be working through to have a highly sustainable supply chain. And we're now in the process of developing a veneer and sawn timber mill that can export, or that can develop FSC certified veneer to be exported to the Vietnamese export furniture and flooring market, which is heavily dependent on FSC certification. This is a very, very quick presentation, but I just wanted to make a couple of points that the building sector is really critical to advancing the Paris Agreement, meeting climate targets, and that the forest sector not only is going to provide carbon sequestration, but importantly, sustainable wood products for the circular bioeconomy. And so from our perspective, as an investment manager, we're working closely with industry, financial institutions, and hopefully increasingly regulators to put in place the incentives in the policy environment to ensure that we advance this kind of climate positive built environment. Thanks, JP.
Thank you, Radha. Great presentation. We'll take questions and discuss answers and have a little roundtable discussion afterwards. So for now, we're going to switch over to Troy.
Cool. Thanks for the intro, JP. So I'm going to talk a little bit about bamboo, and one thing just to carry on with Radha's presentation. I don't think I need to convince anyone of the ecological impact. So New Forest is, it's working really well. FSC certified forests in Laos and Australia, New Zealand. And in the United States, North America, Western Europe, there are countries and regions that do a pretty good job at sustainable forestry. And that's actually it's not the case globally, through much of Southeast Asia, South Asia, actually pretty much everywhere in equatorial regions has seen pretty dramatic deforestation over the last 50 years. And so there has to be an alternative in addition to planting forests now if we're going to have a significant mass timber industry. And part of that equation, so concrete and steel, it's a pretty obvious carbon emissions case where, if India, if Southeast Asia, if Sub-Saharan Africa continues to build at the rate that will be necessary for population growth and development, we're going to hit some climate thresholds that we'd rather not hit and contribute to climate collapse. And wood in general, so there are some fast growing species, for example, that New Forest is planting, but still there's a pretty long turnaround. So say you're on a typical like 25 to 50 year lumber cycle, that's just not going to provide the supply that we actually need. So what RIZOME is doing, so we are pioneering bamboo engineered lumber, and bamboo engineered lumber has been around for a while. And what has limited it is a reliable supply chain and a low enough price that it's actually cost competitive with wood. It's a great material. So bamboo is super strong, at least 2.5 times the strength to weight ratio of steel, and similar, at least 2.5 times as strong as, for example, Douglas fir. It also provides a lot of ecosystem services and has a very high biomass production rate, so at least 10 times the biomass production rate of trees, and then reaches maturity to harvest in around 7 years. So basically it's a very fast growth curve, produces a lot of material for construction, uses a lot less land. The more you build with it, the more carbon you draw down from the atmosphere. And it's also a great technical material, so really strong and also really fire resistant. In order to create the lumber and treat it properly, we treat it with borate. So in addition to the fiber structure, it's got essentially a fire retardant treatment, which gives it basically the only Class A fire rating of most biological materials. So just a little bit about the process. You take really large bamboo. So most bamboo that's available throughout the world is moso or luang or other smaller species that are used for chopsticks, toothpicks, cutting boards, fiber, pulp, and paper. So we use Dendrocalamus asper, Giganteus, and Synechius, which are really large bamboo species. Four-side plane them into long, small boards and laminate those boards into pretty much any size or shape that our customers demand, whether those are panels like plywood or boards and dimensions for structural uses. And a big threshold that we're just about to hit is when we actually reach price parity and the supply chain is large enough to start servicing really large customers. And that's pretty close. We're building our second factory at the moment and have a pretty ambitious scale to scale up. Another aspect of bamboo that is critical is, there's this whole circular carbon accounting system where carbon needs to be drawn down from the atmosphere as CO2 sequestered into either the soil, into forest biomass, or into the built environment. And we believe that bamboo is one of the most efficient ways of doing this on a land use basis. It just grows really fast, and when you cut it down, it grows right back. So unlike trees, or most trees, when you cut them down, you have to replant, so you get a lot of carbon loss. When you cut down bamboo, it just shoots up a new shoot. And then that biomass can go into the built environment. So it's a very efficient mechanism for sequestering CO2 and putting it into buildings as a storage solution. And internally, just to give a sense of scale of how big can bamboo, how much can we actually contribute to the global climate crisis? Internally at RIZOME, we have a 10 gigaton drawdown goal by 2050, which means about like a 1% replacement of timber products. And so that's just RIZOME. That's our own internal operation. And that would be about 1 million hectares planted and about 1,000 processing facilities globally. So that's the scale that we can imagine our own internal operation reaching. And then the actual industry itself can be much larger. If bamboo is price competitive with wood, if it can provide a technically superior material, and has the supply chain and reliable whatever the commodity structure that lumber has now, with perfectly graded materials, OSB, different kinds of plywood, different kinds of boards and dimensions. It needs to be that precise to enter modern construction projects, and it's right on the cusp. We're one of the only companies right now creating structural products. And there will be more and more coming online. There's a lot of people planting right now, and it's a crop that should go pretty much around the world over the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years. We can imagine a few million hectares planted, which would be a major contribution. And I think we'll stop and take some questions.
Thank you very much, Troy. That was a great introduction to a material which, is, as we look at the regions across the world, it's used more in some regions, less in others. It has, traditional uses in some regions, right? In Hong Kong, scaffolding, for example. And so as a structural material, I know myself also as a designer, it's becoming more and more attractive, and the engineered wood products that you can make from it, and also in how to connect the elements together. A lot happening there. Okay, I want to start off our question and answer session with a question for both of the panelists, Radha and Troy. And it's about, setting up. Radha, you talked about how, FSC is a good third-party system, and you're starting to also find uses of it in Asia and Australia, right? In Europe and especially North America, it's more established. And Troy, for bamboo, right? Those kind of certifications will also become necessary. To set these, to set up certification, but also a step before that, to make the timber in bamboo material which is accepted by clients and engineers and designers. What are some of the hurdles that you've faced, especially now speaking in Asia and Australia, governmental, societal? How are these materials perceived? Are they even efficient materials? What are some of these hurdles that you've come across?
Troy, do you want to start?
Sure, I can chime in. I mean, one, FSC is a pretty good certification, like covers a lot of your bases. A lot of projects slip through that, maybe are lower quality than others, but it's a pretty good certification.
It's robust.
In terms of bamboo can go through FSC certification. Our bamboo from Vietnam does. We're working on that in the Philippines. It's complex with gathering thousands of farmers with bamboo on individual land plots into FSC certification in countries where there's not a large centralized plantation where you only need one partner to do certification, rather, talking to individual farmers. Like, it's a more complex process. And also part of that is, indigenous land rights. We're planting in the Philippines on mostly indigenous land. Land title is an issue. There's a whole lot of legal reasons why people have been marginalized. And one of the ways in which we believe bamboo can contribute is that it is not inherently a centralized product. So, for example, pine or eucalyptus plantations, if you've ever tried to cut down a full-size Douglas fir tree and process it yourself, it would be too much for one person to handle. They're just too big and too heavy. Like, it's not human scale. But rural farmers can process bamboo with low-tech equipment and produce just as high quality and high grade spec material once it goes through a more sophisticated manufacturing process. So decentralized farmers, co-ops, basically poor people can grow material and enter a global supply chain that's actually producing very high quality products. And that's really not the case where very expensive equipment has to be used at the farming level. So that's one thing where bamboo is sort of an inherently less centralized, lower cost, lower tech, and appropriate for equatorial regions where there's been the most deforestation, the most sort of like land grab, but also like has seen the lowest contribution towards structural lumber.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, in Southeast Asia, we face some of the same issues in terms of sustainable forest management. And certainly questions of land tenure, community engagement, and also we are often dealing in a place like Indonesia, for example, you're dealing in a mixed landscape where you've got maybe areas that are degraded, that have been logged over multiple times and could have, establishment of new plantations, but significant areas of remnant tropical forest or, high quality natural forest that needs to be retained. So there's a lot of work that goes into understanding the land use and how do we actually ensure that the productive areas are integrated into that broader landscape. And certainly we're also looking at models where we can have agroforestry community outgrowers so that we start to scale up and create more economic opportunities. So very much agree with Troy on that. I think the next big issue that we see on the horizon, or it's already here, is how do we start getting carbon accounting integrated into the supply chain? Mm-hmm. And so that's something that for example, we're involved in a technical committee that's figuring out how carbon accounting is going to be integrated into the land use sector. So that will affect everything from the forest through to the mill and to sale, and actually think about how carbon is stored in the landscape as well as in the harvested wood products, and how that gets accounted and how that is actually disclosed through the supply chain is going to be, I think, a major factor in what kind of land use we incentivize and how the built environment actually changes.
Yeah.
Right, and there I think it,
as well.
Go ahead, Troy.
On just the carbon accounting piece. So, what we measure, we can solve for, right? And we want to say we want to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but actually there's a lot of waste in the processing of wood. And when you cut down, like how much carbon is actually released from the soil? Like there's a lot of things that we kind of know, but we don't know very precisely. And one of the technologies that we're working with is essentially tracking every single pole of bamboo from planting to harvest, through processing, so that it's like very well-defined carbon accounting, at least as well as we can possibly get. And carbon is only one metric for doing something good, but it is a metric that you can get paid for. And it's also a metric that is like sort of the most obvious problem. But one of the strategies that I think will become more and more available is essentially tracking every single tree in a forest, at least a plantation style forest. And one of the reasons why it's easy on bamboo is that we have very distinct clumps of bamboo. Whenever we go out and harvest, we know exactly where the clump is. With a geotag, we can weigh each pole as it comes into harvest. We know the amount of material loss. We know what building it goes into. I think that will more and more be the case.
And I also think I agree with you, Troy. Right? It's one metric, and it's a good metric, carbon. And I think this is also where governments come into play, right? They also need to ensure that there's also a legal framework, there's incentives, and so forth. So it's really important that we work with governments and give them the right technical information for that, which I'm sure Radha is exactly what you guys are doing in New Forests. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. We're getting some questions coming in the Q&A, which I do want to use some of our time to answer them. They're a bit more specific, and especially bamboo. So Troy, you're definitely piquing some interest here.
It's a pretty unknown material at this point, at least in the design structural architecture community, because it's new. We've had a pretty consistent lumber supply chain for a few hundred years. That technology has been essentially optimized, and the bamboo technology has not yet hit that level.
Right. So just to give you a flavor of some of the questions, right? How do you actually change the shape of the bamboo? I mean, you talked a little bit to the lamination process. You know, bamboo, and if you do make engineered bamboo products, you have linear elements, but can you also make panels similar to CLT? So can you talk a little bit about, you know, what kind of products can you actually manufacture from bamboo?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. I mean, the reason we started RIZOME was to take the technology that our team had developed for round pole bamboo construction and dimensionalize it so it could access the global construction market by making panels and making structural elements like beams, CLT, etc. So you take a round pole of bamboo, you cut it into small boards that are, you know, rectangular boards about 10 millimeters thick, 35 millimeters wide, 3.2 meters long. And that's sort of a standard input into pretty much every building material you can imagine. You either glue them up, and, you know, carbon-2 compliance glues, they're pretty industry standard. You glue them up into a panel. It's a very strong fire-resistant panel, or you make a beam. It's really a small format input into anything that you can build, and that has a pretty wide, you know, it has a very wide range of uses, from aesthetic uses to flooring, cabinets, furniture at the high end, which can replace hardwoods or other often unsustainably harvested materials. You know, there's just no mahogany left in the world. To structural panels. Pretty soon, just the board foot cost, or the, you know, cubic meter cost of bamboo versus wood will be about the same. So just on a raw material level, we're going to be able to start competing with really, really cheap materials like OSB. And that's a few years down the line. Like we've proven out the technology, we're building capacity, but for this to take off, it's going to be another 7 to 10 years for the industry to hit the scale where it's going to be as common as wood. So, you know, we have time. Like, you can order products from us, but that's like 0.0001% of projects that are going on. So what we're essentially doing is proving the largest manufacturing scale on the planet at the moment, and building a replicable model of about 1,000 hectare bamboo plantation, mixed native forest for basically ecosystem restoration, and then a processing facility where local people take the bamboo in a pretty low-tech environment, and that goes to a centralized lamination facility in each region that's a little bit more high-tech and to spec, that can then make products in the format the customers actually order them in.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also, one of the questions I, as a designer, always also sometimes faced with is, do we source a local material which is non-sustainable, or but it has, you know, it's short distances, short travel time, you know, local resources are working on it, or do we source a sustainable material but it's from further away, right? So Radha, how do you what's your answer, or not answer to that question, or how do you see that, and how would you prefer it to be answered? And linking in Troy, can bamboo sometimes help solve that, actually, because there's not a local wood available, and in that case, could bamboo actually, you know, fill that gap?
Yeah, actually, it reminds me. Some years ago, I was in Vietnam. I was in Ho Chi Minh City, and I was at a teak manufacturing facility, and they were making kitchen tables.
Hmm.
So I went, got in there and then went through the whole factory. And I was taking a bunch of investors on a tour and got to the end where the end product is done and then they pack it up to ship it. And I'm from Richmond, Virginia in the US. And there were these big flat boxes that they were starting to pack the furniture. And it was all going to the port of Baltimore, which is about 2 or 3 hours from where I grew up. And like kind of global supply chains kind of like really hit me in that moment, because earlier that day, we'd seen a warehouse with timber from like around the world. So it basically went to Vietnam, got manufactured, and then was getting spit back out to the US and Europe. So look, fundamentally, that is to get back to your earlier point, Jan, that's fundamentally a question of regulation, right? We are going to have to see things like, carbon pricing start getting integrated into supply chains, and that's going to change, the relative, economic value of different products. So in the meantime, I guess as consumers and designers, we have to be thinking about those issues as we do our sourcing and what are the trade-offs. But in markets like here in Australia, I was giving the example of our Timberland business. Because we've seen mass timber take off, we are building a CLT plant and a GLT plant. We're developing a small kind of sort of a little closed loop, what's the word I'm looking for? Industrial ecology. We're even creating a little closed loop in Tasmania where we're going to be taking waste product and creating kind of composite decking products. So I think there are opportunities to start investing in local capacity and have some integrated supply chains where we can have the local forest and the processing together. And I think that's where looking for opportunities like that is critical. But mass consumption of these wood products is still kind of reliant on this kind of global supply chain.
Yeah.
Yep.
I can chime in for a second on that. So. Yep. Places with very established lumber industries that have been harvested sustainably. I think of like West Coast North America, I think of Scandinavia. These are like obvious examples that are like, okay, they're doing a pretty good job. And it's not to denigrate equatorial regions. It's just that, you can see from the data, there's really large scale deforestation for a wide variety of reasons. It's a complex issue. So one of the things that, and shipping cost and shipping carbon footprint is actually less than most people could imagine. Like you're shipping it all across the world, it must have a huge carbon footprint. It's usually a much lower level of impact than sort of like the actual growing and cutting process. Like if you're harvesting virgin forest, and like that's a much bigger ecological impact than shipping globally. But anyway, the regions that have had these sort of long successful industries of sustainable forestry are pretty well capitalized, and it's very expensive to build a new modern lumber manufacturing facility. And so it's actually, I think, the responsibility of like international investment to actually go into regions that maybe have had like lower capex expenditure in these areas for creating local markets. Like I'm just thinking about India in particular. India can grow a lot of bamboo. It does grow a lot of bamboo. None of it's used for construction materials at the moment, but it could be. So grown in India, manufactured in India, and used in India, or any other region that's facing really fast population growth is going to be essential. And that material is going to be cheaper than any other material available on the planet. So it's a really obvious investment case and sort of like building manufacturing capacity in places that haven't had it or typically export. So I think there's actually just a lot of opportunity for whatever lumber investment companies or manufacturing companies to come into these regions to service the local market, or at least provide money to peoples from multilateral groups or whatever it is to actually build local.
Thank you. All right, we've come to the end of our session. So I'd like to thank our two panelists, Troy and Radha. for your insights and presentations, and thanks to all the participants for joining us.
Thanks, JP. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And to our attendees, you can find our next session by visiting the CarbonPositive website agenda page. And we look forward to seeing you in the following sessions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.